Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be sharing with you 5 basic embroidery stitches that every beginner should know before they start embroidering. So the 5 I'm going to be going through today are the running stitch, the back stitch, the split stitch, the stem stitch, and the satin stitch. So for each stitch I'm going to demonstrate how to complete that stitch, and I'll also talk a little bit about what that stitch might be useful for, an example of an embroidery project that it might be used in. So we're going to start off with the running stitch. Now, the running stitch is a really simple stitch, and it's kind of the basis, the foundation for all embroidery stitches. So to start off with the running stitch, you're going to want to come up from the back of the embroidery hoop, and then you're going to go forward a little bit. I'm going to go forward probably about, I think, a centimeter, about a pinky's width, for my next stitch, and I'm going to pull that through. Alright, so then the next step, you're just coming from the back of the hoop again. You're going to go forward just a little bit, pull it tight, and then you're going to go forward that pinky's width again. So with the running stitch, you're going to get a nice line of little stitches. They're not going to be connected, and that's one of the main downfalls of this running stitch, and why you probably won't see the running stitch used in a lot of more advanced embroidery projects, just because that kind of disconnected look isn't really a common thing most people are going for in embroidery projects. Now, if you're doing some sort of lettering, this could be useful. Or if you just want like a dotted line in something, if you're doing a more illustrative embroidery project and there's an area where you want a dotted outline or something like that, then this is the perfect stitch for that. But all in all, the running stitch is just a great stitch to know because it's kind of the basis for most stitches. If you know how to do a running stitch, then you can kind of learn how to do all the other basic stitches that I'm going to share with you today. This is also a great stitch if you're starting out just to practice, kind of just going through the motions of embroidering. So grab a hoop, grab some fabric, grab some thread and a needle, and just practice the running stitch a couple times just to get the feel for embroidering. And that's a great stitch for that. So that's the running stitch. Pretty simple, just a lot of disconnected stitches. I don't use it all the time, but it's a good thing to know. So now we're going to move on to the back stitch. So the back stitch is pretty simple. It's very similar to the running stitch. So we're going to start just like the running stitch. Coming from the back of the embroidery hoop, pulling it tight, and then we're going to go forward that pinky's width again. And go through. So far it's been the same as the running stitch. Now, so far it's pretty similar to the running stitch. Now, instead of going forward just a little bit, you're actually going to go forward that same pinky's width. And then, instead of continuing like you would with the running stitch, you're actually going to go back, hence the name back stitch, through the hole you last made in the previous stitch. And then from the last stitch, you're going to go forward that pinky's width and back through the last hole you just made. So the back stitch is kind of the next evolution of the running stitch. It's basically a running stitch, but instead of being disconnected, all of the stitches are connected to form a really nice smooth line. This is one of my favorite stitches if I'm doing outline work. It's pretty simple to understand, and it does a great job of doing any sort of outline or detail work you need it to do, especially when these things are linear. If you're doing linear work, the back stitch is great. There are some other stitches that I'll show today that are better for outline work with curves, but the back stitch is definitely something that you should know. You're going to be using it all the time in embroidery projects, so make sure you get it down, but it's pretty easy to understand, and it's a very versatile stitch to use. Okay, so that's the back stitch. So now we're going to move on to the split stitch. The split stitch is actually my favorite stitch to do, and I really like outlining curves with it. So starting off, just like any other stitch, come from the back of the hoop. Then you're going to go forward about a pinky's width. Pull tight. Okay. Now, instead of going forward a full pinky's width, like with the back stitch, you're going to go forward about half a pinky's width. So about half the length of the stitch you'd normally make. Go through. And instead of, like the back stitch, going through the last hole you made, you're instead going to, hence the name, split the entire last stitch. So halfway through the last stitch you made and splitting the strands, you're going to go through. And then from the last stitch you made, you're going to go forward half a pinky's width. And you're going to split the last stitch you made in half. So the split stitch is different from the back stitch in the sense that instead of just going through the last hole, you're actually going back further and you're splitting the last stitch you made. This makes for an even smoother line of stitches. As you can kind of see in the back stitch while I'm continuing this split stitch, there are definitely little areas where you can see, oh, this is where it ends, this is where the next stitch begins, but they're all continuous. In the split stitch, it becomes a little harder to tell and the line becomes a lot smoother as you do this stitch because you're actually stitching into the last stitch you made. I really like to use the split stitch for outline work. It's great for outline work overall, whether it's linear or curves. I find that split stitch works better on curves than with the back stitch. For one main reason, because you are splitting the last stitch you make, every stitch kind of influences the stitch before and the direction of that stitch. And so when you're doing something like curves, that continuous influence kind of helps follow that curve a little bit better. It also helps you're only going forward about half the length of your normal stitch. So overall, there's just less chance that you'll get that kind of fragmenty look in the back stitch when you create a curve, and it'll follow those lines a lot better. So like I said, the split stitch is my favorite to do. I use it all the time. I love the split stitch. I think it looks really nice, and it's just really good for line work or lettering or anything like that. So before I move on, I'm going to grab my next needle and move on to the stem stitch. So usually if I was doing an embroidery project, I'd tie off, but today I'm just going to cut it because I'm just making a little practice thing here to show you all the basic stitches. So I've got my next needle, and before I start the stem stitch, I'd just like to say if you enjoyed today's video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and like this video so you don't miss a future video. I upload weekly, and if you enjoyed today's video, comment down below, help out the algorithm, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. So moving on to the stem stitch. A lot of people really like the stem stitch. It's not my favorite. So the stem stitch is kind of similar to the other stitches. It's creating a continuous line of stitches that's really good for linear work or outline work or things like that. So to start the stem stitch, you're going to start like any other stitch, coming from the back of the embroidery hoop, pulling tight, and then you're going to go forward that pinky's width. Okay, now instead of pulling it tight, you're going to hold back this loop you just made, and you're going to split the difference between the two holes you have. So going right in the middle of the two, I'm going to come up, and then I'm going to pull tight. Then I'm going to go forward. Instead of doing a pinky's width again, you're going to go about halfway like you would have for the split stitch. Don't pull it tight, hold the loop, and now instead of having to guess and split the difference, you're just going to go through the last hole you made that's in the center there. So going up through here and then pulling tight. So when you're doing the stem stitch, the first time you kind of split the difference is the only time you have to guess. Otherwise, you're just going through the previous hole, like you see me doing here. I hold the loop. I come up through the previous hole. There we go. And then I pull tight. So overall, the stem stitch is great for line work, and like the name kind of explains, stems. If you're doing floral embroidery, the stem stitch is great for stems or leaf work. Overall, the stem stitch just has this kind of ropey look to it that I'm not the biggest fan of, but I know a lot of people do really like the stem stitch. It is a pretty fun stitch to do. It does take time. It's kind of one of the slowest stitches that I'm showing you today because you have to take the time and hold that loop. It kind of slows down the process. when you're doing a split stitch or a back stitch or even a running stitch, you can really just get into the flow of it and just crank them out. But the split stitch takes a while longer. So while I finish up the split stitch, I just want to say I previously uploaded a hat embroidery tutorial for a flower design. In the description box of that video, there's a free download link to that sample that I used. So if after today's video you feel like you want to give embroidery a try, or you just want a new project to try, go check out that video. I'll link it in the description below, and I'll put it up in the right-hand corner of this video right now. Go check that out if you want to follow along with the tutorial and do your own embroidery project. All right, so that's the split stitch. So going on to the next stitch, we have the satin stitch. Now, the satin stitch is a very, very common stitch, and it's basically just a filler stitch. You're going to use the satin stitch whenever you want to fill in an area with color. So to start off, you're going to come from the back. I just have this little rectangle drawn out, which will show the shape that I want to fill. So pull it tight. And for the satin stitch, I'm actually going to be doing some of the longest lengths of stitches that you've seen here. So I'm going to go across to the other end, and I'm going to pull tight. Now, there's two ways of kind of continuing the satin stitch. There's kind of like the floss saver way, and then there's the normal way. So I'm going to do a couple the normal way, and then I'm going to do a couple the floss saver way. I'm going to show you the difference. So for the normal way, I'm going to go back to the side I started on, come up through, and then go to the other end and pull tight. Now the floss saver way, I'm actually going to start at the end I just finished on. Create a hole next to it, but not coming up from the same hole so you don't pop the last stitch. And then going back to the opposite side. And then, once again, for the floss saver method, starting off from the side you just ended on by starting a hole next to the hole you just made, not the same, and then going to the opposite side. So once I do some more of this, I will show you kind of the difference between those two methods. But to continue, I'll just explain a little bit about what the satin stitch is used for. So the satin stitch is basically just a layering of parallel stitches, and so you get a nice flat, even wash of that thread. So it's great for filling in areas. I would recommend always use parallel lines unless you are doing something particular. So for example, that hat embroidery tutorial I do a lot of this satin stitching, and I kind of alter the direction of some of the lines to showcase kind of the form of some of the petals in that flower. And doing that is totally fine. But if you want the smoothest area and you're not trying to outline form or anything like that, make sure all your stitches are parallel just so it looks more even. Now, some people also like to kind of space out their satin stitches, so I'll show you that. So say I do a satin stitch like this, where there's a gap now in between. Some people like to do that and kind of fill out the shape initially with just some looser, more spread out stitches. And then they kind of like go back in between and fill them out. I don't always do this, but sometimes I do. It just kind of depends on the project, how big the space I'm filling out is. There's not necessarily an advantage to it. It just kind of gradually builds it up instead of very slowly but surely everywhere you pass, you're doing the satin stitch completely. So it's kind of up to you whether you want to do this or not. It just depends on me for the project or not, whether I do this. All right, so there's the satin stitch. You can see it's just kind of like a smooth, I didn't do the best job. There's a couple gaps over here, but it's just how you kind of get that flat area of the thread. Now on the back, you can see kind of the difference between that floss saver and the regular. So if you do the regular, you're just going to have these lines. You're basically going to have this repeated on the back. And that wastes, twice as much thread as the floss saver, where you're just going to have these little dots. If you're doing or going through holes right next to the ones you just ended in, you're saving a lot of embroidery floss in the long run. All right, so that's 5 basic embroidery stitches that every beginner should know before they start embroidering. the running stitch, the back stitch, the split stitch, the stem stitch, and the satin stitch. I hope you found this video helpful. If you want to do an embroidery project and you're stuck on ideas, go check out my past video on the hat embroidery tutorial for the flower. The pattern in there is free to download. You can embroider on anything. It doesn't just have to be a hat. I just show it being done on a hat. So grab your supplies and check out that video. And thank you for sticking around and enjoy. Bye.